Now, nowadays it seems to me that we have a whole lot of people, and I'm sure there's been other seasons like this in our country, but this is really the first season I've experienced in my life where we have a lot of people who seem to be standing up in opposition to our government and to our society. It seems like images of picket signs and protesters and crowds in cities are pretty much the hallmark staple of the news nowadays. It's really been that way probably for a couple of years. And to some degree, America was built on this idea of opposing tyranny, right? I mean, in the Revolutionary War, it was the tyranny of the British monarchy over the American colonists. In World War I, it was the tyranny of the German Empire. And then again in World War II, the Nazi Reich. But today, it seems like we're standing up in opposition all of a sudden in an inward sense, right? Instead of an external tyranny that we're opposing, now it's a perceived tyranny in our society that all these people are standing up against. Now, in my undergraduate program in Northern California, I actually experienced a couple of incidences of rioting that took place in downtown Chico. I remember it was one Saturday night in 2008. I lived probably about a mile from campus, which was just outside of the party zone. And it turns out the party zone was actually also the riot zone, believe it or not. And so one night, Saturday night in 2008, I remember seeing images pop up on the news that night that resembled apocalyptic films. Just huge crowds of college students out in the streets of Chico yelling, drinking, vandalizing, and then hundreds of law enforcement on the other side in riot gear with shields and pushing them back and arresting those who were violent. Now the funny thing about this is, the day after, nobody knew why they were rioting. They had no idea. And my best guess is a fraternity house party, something like what you're seeing on the TVs here, probably got out of hand. In Chico, that usually meant something was on fire in the middle of the street. Typically it was an old sofa, which they eventually banned couches from being on porches in Chico because the students kept lighting them on fire. So either an old sofa or someone's old beat-up car. And then when law enforcement responded to the circumstance, to the situation, to protect these students from themselves, they wouldn't obey. So then you get hundreds of college students running around downtown Chico, and they're passing other fraternity parties that are getting out of hand, and all those people are joining in, and now all of a sudden you have a major incident on your hands, right? None of them knew why they were rioting. In essence, they were just rioting against law. They didn't want anyone to tell them what to do. They were rioting against the very people who were sent there to protect them. Now, if you've been to church with us recently, you know we've been walking through the book of 1 Peter, and we were talking last week about how Peter's urging these Christian people who have been exiled from their homeland. They're spread out throughout the Roman Empire, and they're different and they're weird. They're the newcomers on the block here. And so people have an understandable cautiousness towards these Christians. They're concerned. They don't know what their deal is. They don't know them very well. They're different. They're weird. They have a different faith system. And Peter's urging these exiles to be on their best behavior because of the natural presumptions people will make about them. But they weren't just geographically exiled either, were they? We talked about how when we give our lives to Jesus, we entrust that He's going to give us citizenship in a new kingdom, a kingdom that comes after our time here on this earth. We say that just as much a man as you and me, if Jesus can be raised again, then so can we. We trust that Jesus is going to give us a green card in heaven, permanent citizenship there, and we're going to get a visa in return in this life. So what Peter's going to do now is he's going to start addressing specific examples of what this is going to look like for them. And the topic today is, as sojourners and exiles in this life, as people who are ultimately just passing through, people who have a home elsewhere, how do we respond, how do we relate to the governments that currently rule over us in this life? Sure, we have a home elsewhere, but for now, we have jobs in this country. We own land in this country. So how do we relate to the governments over us, knowing that one day we will be in a different kingdom, that our homes here are simply temporary? So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and open them up to 1 Peter chapter 2. Today we're looking at verses 13 through 17. Give you guys a little more time to get there. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor." Now, I get the wonderful privilege this morning of talking about politics at church without actually talking about politics at church, right? It might be true that we're sojourners and exiles in this life. But again, we still have jobs here. We still own land here. We still have problems that need to be solved here and now. So how are we supposed to see our relationship to the governments of this earth when we know our home will ultimately be elsewhere? I want to focus in real quick first this morning on this last verse, because there's something really interesting taking place here. This letter was written in ancient Greek. We're reading it in English, but Peter was actually Hebrew, right? He was a Jew. And so sometimes, in order to understand the ways he's writing and why he's writing the ways he's writing, we have to understand how Jewish people wrote, how they phrase things. And there's something that Jewish writers would do, where they would take a section of something they were saying, maybe even just a sentence, and they would make a statement at the beginning, then they would mimic that statement at the end of that section, right? Either exactly or very closely. And when they did that, they were basically putting brackets around everything that happened in the middle to highlight it, to bring it out, to show a relationship between this entity. And so we can read this first statement, honor everyone, or honor all people, and the last statement, honor the emperor, or honor the king. We can read it as what's called an inclusio. This is the grammatical term for it. He's putting brackets around this sentence, basically saying, I'm summing up everything I just said in these 4 two-word sentences, 3 words in one case. And here's the relationship. We can only do the things in the middle well if we do the things on the outside well. We love the brotherhood, the church, and we worship God well when we honor our society and we honor our government. The flip side to that is we ought to honor our society and our government without worshiping our society or our government. You see, we fear God, we worship God alongside the brotherhood, the people of the church. You can see how that center is segmented there. But we honor our government and our culture by alongside the people in our society, alongside everyone else. So that's what he's going for here. And I think that in the very minimal sense, honoring our society requires at least 2 things. Following the laws that our conscience can follow, while participating in the system that develops and regulates those laws. In other words, we want our law enforcement to think of Christian people and have a smile show up on their faces. We want every new president that enters into the White House to see the church, all of us collectively who put our faith in Jesus Christ, right? We want them to see the church as an asset to this country. When our legislators, whether they're over at the town hall here in Fallon, or over in Carson City, or in Washington, when they face difficult moral decisions, we want to be in a position that they reach out to us for support, for guidance in those moral decisions. We ought to put a smile on people's faces in the way we participate with society. And one of the ways that I've thought about doing this is we have these license plate covers that say Oasis Community Church on them, right? And we keep them in a bin back there. You may have seen them when you walk out of the sanctuary. There's been a few times where I've thought to myself, I should put one of these on my car. And then I stop and I think, well, what if I accidentally cut somebody off? And then they see Oasis Community Church, and that's going to make them think worse of Christian people. Or what if I lose track of my speed on the highway, and then I get pulled over? And that officer's going to walk up to my car, and she's going to see this placard on the back, and what's that going to make her think of Christian people? And so often I allow my fear of failing to do good deeds to prevent me from actually stepping out and trying in the first place. And so what I've decided is I'm going to take one of these placards and I'm going to put it on both of my cars. And I'm going to let this motivate me to be the best driver out there on the road. I'm going to use this as a ministry to our society, to the law enforcement in our community, and to all the other drivers on the road. And every time I use my blinker, I'm going to say, that one's for you, Jesus. Just like those football players, when the kicker runs out on the field and he points up, that's me when I use my blinker. When I'm tempted to speed and go 5 miles over, just to save myself 2 minutes on my commute, I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, hold up. Jesus, these 2 minutes more that I'm going to spend in the car, these are for you. Because in the very least, honoring our society means following its laws, especially the ones that don't conflict in any way, shape, or form with our conscience, with our faith. We can do that. So I know the question in everyone's mind, and frankly it was the question in the minds of the readers that Peter's writing to as well, is what about when your society isn't worth or worthy of honoring? What happens if our government turns against us and they start to make laws that we might not be able to follow in good conscience? If they start to try and force me as a pastor to do things that I really can't do? What do we do then? You see, the cruelty and unfairness of some governments may keep us from wanting to honor those governments. It can be very hard to respect and serve someone or something, an institution, that has hurt you. And nobody knows that better than Peter. You see, when Peter says honor the emperor, he's talking about none other than Nero, Claudius Augustus Germanicus, the famous Emperor Nero. This guy was a bad dude. On the year, the day was June 18th. The year was 64 AD. We're talking approximately 30 years or so after the crucifixion, right? 64 AD, June 18th, in the evening when a fire broke out in the city of Rome. And the emperor, Nero, was nowhere to be found. He, in fact, was several miles away in another one of his palaces. And when he heard about the fire, he rushed back to Rome and he helped to organize the relief efforts to fight the flames. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The fire raged on for 6 days, and it flared up again for 3 days following. And in total, 10 out of the 14 districts of Rome were completely destroyed. And despite Nero's generosity, he actually opened up the palace to try and house some of these displaced people. Despite that, rumors began to circulate that it was actually Nero who ordered the fire to be lit in the first place. You see, he wasn't very well liked by this point in Rome. And so people began to develop fables, stories, that depicted Nero standing atop his palace, drinking wine and playing music while the whole city went to ash. So Nero was in trouble. He needed to take the pressure off of himself. And so he needed a scapegoat to deal with this accusation of his. And it just so happened that of the 4 districts in Rome that were still standing, 2 of them were heavily populated by Jews and by Christians. And there he had his scapegoat. And he actually blamed the Christian people for starting the fire in the first place. There's an ancient Roman historian named Tacitus that writes a little bit about this, and I'd like to read to you guys some of what he says. He says, "In spite of every human effort, of the emperor's largesse, and of the sacrifices made to the gods, nothing sufficed to allay suspicion, nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians, who are hated for their abominations, and he punished them with refined cruelty. Christ, from whom they take their name, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Stopped for a moment, this evil superstition reappeared not only in Judea, where was the root of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things sordid and abominable from every corner of the world come together. Thus, first those who confessed that they were Christians were arrested, and on the basis of their testimony, a great number were condemned." He continues, "Before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed like dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were set on fire early in the night so that they might illumine it. Nero opened his own gardens for these shows, and in the circus he himself became a spectacle, for he mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, or he rode around in his chariot." This is interesting. "All of this aroused the mercy of the people, even against these culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment. For it was clear that they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person." This is a man who was there, recording what happened. Nero used Christian people as a scapegoat to get the pressure off of himself. He made public spectacles of persecution out of them. He used the vast colosseums and the arenas of Rome to make grandiose displays, right? To get the attention off of himself. And even Tacitus, and you listen to him right, he's not too fond of the Christians, is he? But even he can say that this had nothing to do with the good of the community. It simply had to do with the cruelty of one man. And it's that man, believe it or not, that Peter is urging these Christians to honor. What? Really? Why would we honor that guy? He could have urged them instead to fight back, to riot in the streets. He could have urged them to flee Rome and set up a camp in the hillside and they can live in peace all by themselves. In the very least, he could have told them to just tough it up and stick it out. And you'll get through this. But he didn't. He took it a step beyond that. He said, no, I want you to honor the emperor. This guy who was so wicked and evil. And when he says that, he's not talking about being apathetic. He's not talking about apathy. He's talking about strategy. The question is, how would rioting in the streets and standing up in opposition to Nero have helped the church or helped them worship God? Remember that last verse. It wouldn't have. In fact, rioting in the streets probably just would have reinforced this stigma that Nero's trying to create about the Christians. People would have begun to be afraid of them, even more than they already are. In fact, they might have even started to believe that the Christians actually did start this fire. And that makes a very interesting point. You see, Peter is going to get to a place in this letter where he's going to talk about persecution. He's going to talk about the fact that sometimes, no matter how kind we are, no matter how good our deeds are, people are still going to hate us. They are still going to persecute us. It happens all over the world all the time. We're very fortunate in our country to not face this to the same degree. But we may not always be that way. But he doesn't want to talk about it yet. That's chapter 3. He actually brings it up again in chapter 4. How we respond to persecution. Right now, all he wants to say is, The way that you reach your society for Christ is by standing up in support of your society for Christ's sake. You see, he talks about in verse 16 this freedom that we have. Freedom that we're not supposed to use as a cover-up for evil, but instead it should motivate us to good deeds. What freedom do you think he's talking about? He's talking about the freedom that comes from the recognition that this life is not our final resting place. There is a freedom that comes when you commit yourself to the idea that ultimately we are passing through, and the fruit of this life comes afterwards for us. And when you have that freedom, now all of a sudden you can submit yourself to governments and societies that are in fact not worthy of honor, people like Nero, and you can have the freedom and the strength to actually withstand it and support and subject yourselves to that society, to behave and participate in that society. You don't have to partake in society. If you really wanted to, you could leave. You could go in the hill country, you could go in the mountains, you could have your cabin, and you could just hide out and wait for Jesus to come back. But the primary way we reach our society is by standing up in service to our society. There are really two ideas that we have to talk about at church. One is the idea of in-reach ministry. In-reach ministries are the ways that we reach inside of our community to grow. To grow in our faith, to grow in our character. Today, we're going to start off our Momentum class. If you're signed up for the Tuesday course, we're meeting over in the youth building at 2 p.m. Momentum is an in-reach ministry. We're reaching in and spending some time on ourselves to back up a little bit so that we can move forward, to focus on some fundamental Christian beliefs and see if we can dwell in those to get to know God, to get to know ourselves, to get to know the church. Momentum is an in-reach ministry. But we also have outreach ministries in the church. Things that we do to reach outside of ourselves to try to find people who do not know Christ and help them learn to find and follow Jesus. That little brown box by the back door there says benevolence on it. Benevolence is an outreach ministry. The monies you guys give in order to help needy people in our community reaches out to our community, helps our church engage our community. And it is very important that we as a congregation balance these two things well. Because what happens is a lot of churches think that all we have to do is make ourselves look as good as possible. If church is the hip and happening place to be, then everyone will want to be there. That's what they think. And so they spend a lot of time focusing on in-reach ministries. The problem is in-reach ministries take time, they take effort, they take funding, and they take all of you away from the community and into this building. And they're helpful, they're good, we need them. In fact, we're spending more effort here at Oasis to make our in-reach ministries better. However, when your in-reach ministries begin to take your church out of the community because they're always here at the church, then we begin to falter in our outreach to our society, to our government, to everyone else that we're supposed to honor. Each and every one of you, individually, are actually the greatest outreach our church can have. We can run big events, we can run programs and concerts, and we can get people here, and we do that. And that helps. But it's you coaching recreational sports for your kids and the kids of someone else that reaches out to those kids and to those families. It's the people in our church who decide to, say, run for local office or volunteer with the VA or the VFW. It's those people who are gaining contact and access in our community. They're standing up in service to a society, and that standing up reaches out to that society. There's actually a few groups of people this morning that I want to recognize and thank for standing up in such a way that reaches out. So if you are currently in military service, Or if you're a veteran of military service, would you please stand for me real quick? Every one of you, when our society asked for people who were willing to stand up and risk your lives for the sake of everyone else, you did it. And when you stood up, you reached out to our society. You make a better name for Christian people because of your service. And each of you still has a very unique avenue to reach our society. So what I want to do is I want to encourage you all to be proud of your service, to involve yourselves with the VA, with the VFW. Involve yourself on base with those young guys who are currently in the service. You have stories to tell. You have experiences that can help to support this community today. Not just in the past when you served, but today because you served. Everyone give them a round of applause. Thank you for your service. Next, I would like to ask anyone who is a spouse of someone who just stood up, or if you're a spouse of someone who served in the military, a veteran, or is currently in the military, would you guys stand, please? Every one of you, when your spouse stood up in service of this society, you stood up with them. And people don't tell you that enough. You guys experienced things, challenges, perhaps loneliness, perhaps the relational struggle that comes with your spouse being away. And because of the way you stood up in service to this society, you have a unique avenue to reach out to this society. Because this town is full of young families who are going through exactly what you went through, or what you're going through now. But they're doing it without Jesus and the church to lean on. So what I want to do is I want to encourage you to be involved. Be involved with the VA. Be involved with the VFW. Be involved with the events out at the base. Get to know the other military families in our community. You have something special that you can bring into those relationships. Everybody give me a round of applause. Thank you for your service. The last group of people I'd like to stand this morning is, if you're in law enforcement, or if you work in the medical field or at one of our hospitals or in emergency services, would you stand, please? Do we have anyone in the church for that? There she goes. Okay. All of you have a very unique way that you serve our society. You guys see and you face the darkest, most challenging situations of civilian life. And you're there for those people. Not only do you help bring life into this world, but you all literally help people keep them from leaving this world too early. You literally give them more time to find and follow Jesus Christ. And because of that, you guys have a unique avenue to reach our society, to reach out to our society. You've seen things from a perspective that no one else in our country, no one else in our culture has seen. And because of that, your coworkers and your patients and the criminals that you confront, they need you to bring Jesus with you into those environments. You guys stand up every day in service of this society. Thank you for your service. Give them a round of applause. The reality is, I could ask plumbers and electricians and all these people to stand up and thank them for the ways that they serve our society. Because when we involve ourselves with what's going on, we gain an opportunity to reach out to the things that are going on. And we do all of this not out of worship to our country, but out of worship for our God. Out of love for the church. Because we want to tell other people about the wonderful things about our homeland while we're visiting here. That's what we want. And if we can continue to stand up in service when everyone else is standing up in opposition, when the rest of our country is out rioting on the streets, we're going to be the people who are there to patch them up. We're going to be the people who are there protecting them from foreign threats. And by doing that, we just might gain the permission of this society, of this country, to speak to them of Jesus Christ. Lord, I thank you so much for this church. I thank you for the people who are out there every day serving in this culture, in the town of Fallon, all for the sake of earning a name for Jesus Christ in this world. Lord, we recognize that when people think highly of us, they're more likely to think highly of you. So help us to slow down on the road. Help us to be good drivers. Help us to be good citizens. Help us to vote and participate and behave in our culture. Lord, we know that our culture is not always worthy of honor. But we recognize that the way we reach out to that society is by serving them even when they're not worthy of honor. Thank you so much for who you are and what you do. Help us to reach this town. In your name we pray. Amen.